The giantess's steps were steady and powerful, each one shaking Ethan's bones. The wind howled around them, carrying dust and the faint metallic scent of the wasteland. Ethan could hardly breathe, not just because of the heat, but because of the crushing fear in his chest. She didn't speak again, only held him tightly in one massive hand as she walked. Ethan tried to move, but her grip was firm, her fingers like steel bars. Her skin was warm to warm, and every now and then he could feel the faint tremor of her pulse. Her eyes flicked down to him once, just for a moment. It was not the look of a hunter sizing up prey for slaughter. It was something else, something sharper, almost calculating. But that didn't comfort him. If she wasn't going to eat him, then what was she planning? After what felt like hours, she stopped. Ethan blinked against the sudden stillness. They were standing before a massive rock arch that led into a deep canyon. The towering cliffs on either side blocked the sun, casting them into shadow. The air here was cooler, but that didn't make him feel safer. She crouched, her golden eyes fixed on him. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. The silence was heavy, broken only by the soft whisper of wind through the canyon. Ethan tried to speak, his voice trembling. Why? Why are you doing this? Her head tilted slightly, the way an animal reacts to an unfamiliar sound. She didn't understand his words. Instead, she slowly extended her other hand toward him, palm up. He flinched, expecting claws or teeth, but her hand remained open, steady, almost like an offering. Ethan didn't move. His muscles were tense, ready to fight or flee, even though he knew neither option would work. Then, without warning, her fingers curled around him again, and she lifted him closer to her face. Up close, her gaze was overwhelming. Her eyes were alive with strange light, their amber glow shifting like molten gold. They searched his face as if trying to read his thoughts. Ethan could feel the weight of that stare deep in his bones. Then something unexpected happened. She spoke. The words were deep and musical, foreign, but not harsh. He couldn't understand, but her tone was softer. She seemed to be testing the sound of her own voice while looking at him when he didn't respond. Her lips twitched into a small, amused smirk, like she knew he was afraid, and she liked it. Ethan's heart hammered faster. Suddenly, she stood again, turning toward the canyon's interior. The sound of rushing water echoed faintly ahead. She walked deeper, the light growing dimmer as the cliffs rose higher above them. The ground was smoother here, worn by time and wind. Then Ethan saw massive gates made of interlocking bone, polished until they gleamed like ivory. Strange markings were carved into them, symbols that seemed to twist and shift in the low light dots. She approached the gates, and they creaked open slowly, revealing what lay beyond. Ethan's breath caught. It was a camp, but unlike anything he had ever seen. The structures were made from enormous bones and stretched fabric that shimmered with alien colors. Fires burned in deep pits, their smoke curling upward. Strange creatures skittered in the shadows, some with too many legs, others with eyes that glowed faintly. The giantess strode confidently through the camp, and the few figures Ethan glimpsed other giantesses, smaller than her but still towering, paused to watch. Their gazes followed him, their expressions unreadable. Some murmured to each other in low voices. Finally, she stopped before a large enclosure made of curved bone bars. Without ceremony, she lowered him inside. He stumbled as her hand released him, landing on the hard ground. Ethan scrambled to his feet, backing away toward the far side of the enclosure. She crouched outside, her face close to the bars. Her eyes never left his. That stare, it wasn't hunger. It was possession. She said something again in her language, her voice low and deliberate. Then she placed something through the bars, a chunk of strange fruit, its skin glowing faintly in the dim light. Next to it, she set a small container of water. Ethan stared at them, then at her. The message was clear. She wanted him alive. Without another word, she rose to her full towering height and walked away, her spear resting casually on her shoulder. But even as she moved deeper into the camp, Ethan could feel her gaze still on him, sharp and unblinking, like a predator guarding what it had claimed. And deep inside, he knew. This was not rescue. This was captivity. Ethan dangled helplessly in the giantess's grip, the world swaying with each of her long, powerful steps. The wasteland was silent except for the crunch of her armored boots on the cracked earth. He could hear the faint hum of her breathing, slow, controlled, and almost deliberate. She didn't speak. She didn't roar or threaten. That silence was worse. Ethan couldn't stop imagining sharp teeth sinking into him or being dropped into a boiling pot in some alien feast. Every story he'd heard about her kind screamed in his mind. They hunt, they kill, they eat. But something was off. Her gaze, when it flicked down to him, wasn't just the cold look of a hunter. It was intense, yes, but not mindless. There was curiosity there, the heat of her palm pressed into his body. He tried to shift, to push against her fingers, but they were like living stone, molding, warm, and impossibly strong. She didn't even glance at his struggle. The giantess slowed her pace as they approached a jagged ridge. Without warning, she leaped onto a sloping rock and began climbing. Ethan's stomach dropped as the ground fell away beneath them. Her long strides carried them higher, the horizon stretching wide and empty behind. From up here, he could see the skeletons of enormous creatures scattered across the sands, remnants of battles older than human memory. At the top, she stopped. Her shadow fell over him again as she crouched, holding him up at eye level. Those golden eyes studied him in absolute stillness. Her pupils were narrow slits, but they shifted subtly, tracking every movement of his chest, every twitch of his hands. Ethan's throat felt dry. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Then, without warning, her lips moved. The sound that came out was low, musical, and strange, like stone grinding against metal, but with a rhythm almost like singing. He couldn't understand the words, but there was weight to them, as if she were testing him with a question. Ethan's only answer was a nervous shake of his head. A slow smirk curved across her mouth. Not cruel, more like she had confirmed something she suspected. She shifted her hold, sliding him into one hand and reaching for the strap across her armor with the other. From it, she pulled a small cloth pouch, opening it to reveal food. She broke a piece of dried alien meat with her teeth, chewed, and then shockingly offered him a piece. Ethan stared at it, unsure whether it was kindness or bait. When he didn't take it, her smirk faded. She withdrew the meat and tucked the pouch away, then began walking again, heading toward a narrow canyon where the sun's heat eased. The air smelled faintly of water. They passed through towering stone walls that glowed faintly in the fading light. Ethan caught glimpses of carvings, giant hands, blades, and what looked like humans. Kneeling at the far end, the path widened, revealing a settlement unlike anything he'd imagined. Massive bone frames formed the walls of tents, their coverings made from metallic threads that shimmered in shifting colors. Fires burned in deep pits, sending spirals of smoke into the air. The sounds of low, heavy drums echoed faintly between the structures. The giantess moved through it like a queen returning home. Other towering figures appeared, all female, their gazes curious but cautious. Some leaned closer to see Ethan, murmuring words he couldn't understand. She ignored them, heading for a larger structure at the settlement center. At its front stood an enclosure circular, made from polished bone bars thicker than his arm. Without ceremony, she crouched and lowered him inside. Ethan stumbled to the ground, then scrambled to his feet, eyes darting for an exit. The bars were close enough to touch, but impossible to climb. The giantess knelt outside, resting one elbow on her knee as she leaned in close. Her face was only a few feet away. She spoke again, her voice quieter now, almost like she was telling him something important. Ethan's heart raced. He didn't understand, but her tone didn't feel like a threat. It felt final. She slid something through the bars, a flask of water and a chunk of glowing fruit that pulsed faintly, as if alive. Then she rose to her full height, spear in hand, and turned to leave. The other giantesses stepped aside as she passed, their eyes following her, but Ethan's eyes stayed fixed on her retreating figure. Every step echoing in his chest. Whatever she wanted from him, it was clear he wasn't food. But he wasn't free, either. The bone bars were smooth and cold beneath Ethan's fingers. He ran his hands along them, testing for weakness, but they were solid, stronger than steel. No matter how hard he pulled, they didn't even shift. The giantess had placed him here, like someone setting down a prized possession, and then walked away without looking back. The cage was big enough for him to stand and move a little, but it was still a prison. The floor was packed earth, covered in a thin layer of woven matting that smelled faintly of herbs. On one side, a small dish of water sat beside a chunk of glowing fruit. Ethan eyed the food suspiciously, wondering if it was safe. His throat ached for water, but his pride told him to resist. Around him, the alien settlement moved slowly. Giantesses passed by, some carrying bundles of fabric, others dragging the carcasses of strange beasts. Their voices were deep, melodic, but heavy with an accent that made them sound like they were singing even when speaking. From his low position, they seemed even more massive, living walls of muscle and armor. A pair of young giantesses stopped to look at him. One crouched low, peering between the bars. Her eyes were curious, her mouth twitching into a smile that showed sharp teeth. She said something to her companion, who laughed softly before they both walked away. Ethan's heart thudded. He didn't like being the center of attention in a place where he couldn't escape. The evening light faded to deep red, casting the settlement in a strange glow. Fires and massive pits flared to life, sending warmth and shadows across the camp. Ethan sat down against the bars, watching the sparks rise into the alien sky. Somewhere beyond the walls, something howled low and long, a sound that made his skin prickle. A shadow fell across him. He looked up to see her again, the giantess who had captured him. She stood still for a moment, spear resting across her shoulder, watching him. In the flickering firelight, her bronze skin seemed almost to glow. Without speaking, she crouched until her face was level with his. Those molten gold eyes studied him with the same unnerving focus as before. She reached into a pouch and pulled out a strip of some dark meat, pushing it through the bars. Ethan stared at it. She made a small gesture with her hand, urging him to take it. He hesitated, but hunger won. The meat was surprisingly tender, smoky, and rich. She watched every bite, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she placed a small jug of water inside as well. After he drank, she spoke again slowly, as if trying to make him understand. Some of the words were soft, drawn out. Others, sharp, almost clipped. He caught no meaning, but her tone was calmer than before. Then, to his surprise, she reached through the bars and touched his arm. Her fingers were warm, the tips calloused from battle. She didn't grip him, just rested her touch there for a few heartbeats before pulling away. She rose to her full height and walked away into the firelit camp. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay on the woven mat, listening to the deep rumble of distant drums and the crackle of the fires. The giantess's touch lingered in his mind, not threatening, but deliberate. Why keep him here, Why feed him? If she wasn't going to eat him, then what was she planning? Hours later, just as he began to drift into uneasy sleep, the sound of heavy footsteps returned. The giantess was back, but this time, she wasn't alone. Two older giantesses followed her, their armor heavier, their expressions stern. They stopped before his cage, speaking in low tones Ethan couldn't understand. One of them glanced at him and frowned, as if disapproving. The giantess who had captured him spoke sharply in reply, her voice firm, her stance unyielding. The others exchanged glances, then left without another word. Ethan's pulse quickened. Whatever argument had just happened, it had been about him. And she had defended him. When they were gone, she knelt once more, her face closer to the bars than ever. In the firelight, he could see the faint scars along her jawline, the small silver trinkets woven into her hair. She said something, just a few words, and her voice was quieter now, almost protective. Then she reached into her armor and pulled out a piece of cloth, small by her size, but big enough to wrap around Ethan like a blanket. She pushed it gently into the cage. Ethan hesitated, then took it. It was warm from her body, smelling faintly of her and the strange flowers he'd caught on the wind earlier. She stayed there for a long moment, just watching him. Then she finally stood and disappeared into the shadows, leaving him with the sound of drums and the weight of unanswered questions. And Ethan knew, as sleep finally claimed him, whatever this was, it was far from over. The next morning came slowly. A pale blue light crept over the alien settlement, casting long shadows between the towering bone structures. Ethan woke to the sound of deep voices outside the cage, their words rolling like distant thunder. The air was cooler now, but the smell of smoke from the night fires still lingered. He sat up, his blanket still wrapped around his shoulders. Through the bars, he saw Hertha Giantess, who had captured him, speaking to two other warriors. They were both tall, broad-shouldered, their armor decorated with strange silver symbols. Every now and then, one of them glanced toward Ethan, their expressions unreadable. When the conversation ended, the two warriors walked away, but the giantess stayed. She watched them leave before turning her gaze back to Ethan. She approached the cage, crouching until her golden eyes were level with his. For a long moment, she simply studied him. Then she reached into the pouch on her hip and pulled out something strange, an object that looked like a carved stone pendant, marked with deep, swirling patterns. She pushed it through the bars toward him. Ethan hesitated. The pendant was cool to the touch, heavier than it looked. The carvings seemed to shift slightly when the light hit them, almost like they were alive. He looked back at her, confusion clear on his face. She spoke a few words, slowly, firmly, then gestured for him to put it around his neck. Ethan didn't move. He didn't know what it meant, and he wasn't about to agree blindly, but her gaze didn't waver. There was no threat in her eyes, only insistence. Finally, he slipped the pendant over his head. The stone rested cold against his chest. The giantess's lips curved into the faintest smile. She stood, nodding once, before walking away into the heart of the camp. The day passed in uneasy silence. From his cage, Ethan watched the life of the settlement unfold. Giantesses sharpened their weapons, tanned hides from strange beasts, and carried huge baskets of glowing fruit. Children, if they were children, played near the fires, their laughter a low, rumbling sound, but something felt different today. Several times, other giantesses came to look at him, their eyes flicking to the pendant around his neck. Some frowned, others whispered to each other in tones too low for him to hear. Whatever the pendant meant, it had changed how they saw him. As the sun dipped low, the giantess returned. This time, she carried no spear. Instead, she held a wooden tray with food, roasted meat, sliced fruit, and a small jug of water. She sat it carefully inside the cage. Ethan stared at the tray, then at her. She spoke again, her voice steady, but softer than before. The words meant nothing to him, yet something in her tone made him feel less like a prisoner and more like a guest. When he finished eating, she surprised him again. She unlatched the cage door. Ethan froze. She stepped back, leaving the door wide open. Her gaze told him it wasn't a trick. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped outside, his bare feet touching the cool earth for the first time since he'd been captured. The giantess turned and began walking, gesturing for him to follow. They moved through the camp together, the other giantesses watching with open curiosity now. Ethan kept close to her massive strides, knowing that without her, he was nothing more than a vulnerable outsider here. She led him toward a larger structure near the far edge of the settlement. Inside, the air was warm and filled with the scent of herbs. The walls were draped with heavy fabric in deep reds and golds, and in the center lay a massive fur-covered platform. The giantess motioned for him to sit on a cushion near the wall. Then she began pulling objects from shelves, more carved pendants, a large metal bowl, and a bundle of dried plants. She set them out in front of him, with slow, deliberate movements. She began crushing the plants in the bowl, releasing a sharp, earthy aroma. She spoke as she worked, her tone calm but purposeful, as if telling him a story he couldn't understand. When she was done, she placed the bowl in front of him and dipped a finger into the green paste. She touched it lightly to his forehead, then to the pendant on his chest. Ethan flinched, but didn't pull away. Finally, said she leaned back, studying him. The firelight reflected in her golden eyes, making them glow even brighter. She said one last word, clear, firm, and unlike any he'd heard from her before. It sounded almost like a name. His name. Ethan froze. She had learned it, and if she knew his name, what else had she learned about him? Ethan couldn't shake the sound of his own name from his mind. The way the giantess had spoken it slowly, carefully proved she had been listening to him far more than he realized. That night, he slept on the woven mat inside his cage, but it didn't feel like the same prison anymore. The door wasn't locked, yet he stayed inside. The giantess hadn't told him to, but something in her gaze earlier had told him he was safer here than wandering alone through a camp full of strangers her size. When morning came, she returned. This time, she didn't bring food or water first. Instead, she reached into the cage and tapped the pendant around his neck, as if reminding him of its presence. Then she stepped back and gestured for him to follow. Ethan hesitated, but rose to his feet. The giantess waited patiently until he walked out. Once he was beside her, she began leading him through the settlement, the other giantesses stepping aside as they passed. He noticed something new, the way they looked at him. Before, it had been the gaze one gives to a strange animal. Was different, respectful, curious. Some even bowed their heads slightly as he walked past. They reached the far end of the camp, where a wide, flat rock stood like a natural stage. Beyond it, the canyon walls rose high, and water trickled down from somewhere above into a shallow pool. The giantess knelt on the rock and motioned for Ethan to join her. He climbed up, the stone warm beneath his feet. She began speaking, her hands moving in slow gestures. Though he didn't understand her words, her meaning began to take shape. She pointed to herself, then to the settlement, then to the mountains beyond. She mimed fighting, her hands striking through the air. Then she pointed at him directly at his chest, placed her palm over her own heart. Ethan frowned. Trying to piece it together, her next actions made it clearer. She reached for a pouch at her side and pulled out a piece of cloth. It was old, worn, but still intact. She unfolded it carefully. On it was a faded imagey human man, much older than Ethan, standing beside a giantess who looked similar too. The man's hand rested in hers, and both wore pendants like the one now hanging around Ethan's neck. Ethan's breath caught. She tapped the cloth, then tapped him. Then she tapped her own chest again and spoke a word, slowly repeating it until he understood it wasn't just a sound. It was a name. Her name. He didn't dare say it out loud, afraid of getting it wrong. But she seemed to know he understood. Then came the part that sent a chill down his spine. She pointed to the image again, then to her own stomach flat, but strong. She made a circular motion, then held her hands out as if cradling something. A child. Ethan's eyes widened. She was looking for someone. Not just anyone, someone to continue her line. Someone not from her own kind. His mind raced back to the stories he'd heard about the Giantess's tribe. Their numbers were dwindling. Some said their warriors were unmatched, but their people couldn't survive much longer without. Changed now, it made sense. Why she hadn't eaten him. Why she had fed him. Why she had placed the pendant on his chest. Ethan stepped back slightly, his pulse racing. She noticed, her gaze softening, not threatening, but determined. She reached out and rested her palm over his heart again, the way she had done earlier. For a moment they stayed like that, her massive hand covering half his chest, her eyes locked on his. Then she pulled back and stood, towering above him once more. She spoke again, her tone quieter this time, almost like a plea. Ethan didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. She was giving him a choice. Stay and take on a role he never expected, or leave and risk the wasteland alone. The wind stirred between them, carrying the scent of distant rain. Ethan glanced toward the canyon beyond the camp. It looked endless, dangerous. He thought about the nights alone in the wasteland, the gnawing hunger, the threat of predators. Here, at least, he had food, water, and her protection. But staying meant something far bigger and far more permanent. The Giantess waited, silent, her gaze steady. She didn't push him. She didn't trap him. She just waited. And in that stillness, Ethan realized something terrifying. When he'd first seen her, he thought she would eat him alive. Now he understood she wanted to keep him alive, and maybe make him hers. The camp felt different that day. The air was heavy, as if the wind itself was holding its breath. Ethan sat near the bars of his cage, the pendant cool against his chest. He kept turning it in his fingers, remembering the way that Giantess had touched it, the way her golden eyes had waited for his answer. She hadn't come to see him since their talk by the water. Instead, other giantesses had begun to appear, one or two at a time, standing near his cage, watching him. Silently. They didn't bring food. They didn't speak to him. They only studied him as if he were a weapon they weren't sure could be trusted, or a prize they wanted to claim. By midday, the giantess finally returned. But she wasn't alone. 5 other warriors followed her, each wearing heavier armor than she did, their spears gleaming in the sunlight. They surrounded the cage in a loose circle. Ethan's chest tightened. The tallest of the new warriors stepped forward. Her skin was darker, her eyes sharper, her armor etched with more silver than the rest. She spoke in a commanding voice, her gaze never leaving Ethan. The words were foreign, but the tone was unmistakable. This was a challenge. The giantess who had captured him replied, her voice low but firm. She gestured toward Ethan, then to the pendant. Her jaw tight. The tall warrior stepped closer to the bars, crouching until her face was inches away from Ethan's. Her eyes were colder than the night air. She reached through the bars and tapped. The pendant then tapped her own chest. The meaning was clear. She didn't think he was worthy. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. The giantess moved between them, blocking the taller warrior's view. The two spoke rapidly now, their voices rising. The other warriors shifted their stances, gripping their spears tighter. Finally, the tall warrior stepped back and barked a short order. Two of the others moved to the side of the cage and unlatched. The bone door. Ethan froze. The giantess looked down at him, her gaze softer now. She extended her hand, palm open, just like the first time she had captured him. Her voice lowered to something almost gentle as she spoke to him. One slow sentence at a time. He didn't know the exact words, but the meaning sank into him like, "Oh wait, now you decide." Ethan stepped to the edge of the cage, his eyes moving between her face and the warriors behind her. He could see it in their stares. He chose to leave with her. It would not be welcomed by all. If he refused, he might not even survive the night in the wasteland. His throat was dry. "You want me to stay?" "To be yours," he murmured under his breath, knowing she wouldn't understand the words. But she must have caught the tone, because her eyes softened further. The tall warrior stepped forward again, saying something sharp. The giantess replied instantly, her voice rising, her body shifting into a defensive stance. The other warriors watched closely, ready to intervene. The tension was suffocating. Ethan's mind raced. He remembered the long days in the wasteland. The constant hunger, the nights when the cold bit into his bones. Here, he had shelter, food, safety, but staying meant giving up his freedom. It meant being bound to a being who could crush him with a flick of her wrist. But had chosen not to. He thought of the way she had shielded him from the others, the way she had defended him during their arguments. She hadn't hurt him once, even when she could have. Finally, Ethan took a deep breath and stepped out of the cage. The giantess's eyes lit up not with victory, but with relief. She lowered her hand until it was level with him. Slowly, he placed his palm against hers. Her fingers curled around him, lifting him with the same care as before. The tall warrior said something low and dangerous, but the giantess ignored it. She turned, carrying Ethan away from the cage and the circle of warriors. The camp's eyes followed them, whispers rising like wind through dry grass when they reached her tent. She set him down on a fur-covered platform. She knelt in front of him, her massive frame lowering until their eyes were level. Then she spoke, her words slow, deliberate. Ethan couldn't understand them, but he felt the intent. She was promising something. Protection, safety, a future, and though his chest was still tight with uncertainty, one thing was certain. He had made his choice. But in the shadows outside the tent, the tall warrior watched. Her gaze promised that this choice would come with a price. The camp was quiet that night, too quiet. The low hum of voices that usually floated through the air was gone, replaced by the soft crackle of distant fires and the occasional snap of bone in the night breeze. Ethan sat on the fur-covered platform, inside the giantess's tent, the pendant warm now against his chest from being close to the fire. She was outside, speaking in low tones to a pair of other warriors. Ethan couldn't hear the words, but the rhythm of her voice was tense. He knew. Why, ever since he had stepped out of the cage and placed his hand in hers, the camp had been watching them differently. Not everyone had approved, especially not the tall warrior with the cold eyes. Ethan had seen her in the shadows, always watching, always waiting. The tent flap moved. The giantess stepped inside, her expression softer now that she was with him. She set down a tray food, water, and a thick blanket. She gestured for him to eat, but Ethan only took a sip of water. He pointed to the pendant and then to her. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. She didn't understand the words, but her eyes locked on his and didn't look away. Then she sat down beside him, the ground trembling slightly under her weight. For a while, they just sat there in silence. The air felt still, as if something was about to break it. It came suddenly. A sharp sound split the night, a deep horn blast that echoed through the canyon. The giantess shot to her feet instantly, spear in hand. From outside came shouts, the kind that weren't casual conversation, but warning calls. Ethan's chest tightened. She glanced back at him, said a single word, and pointed to the blanket. He didn't move. She repeated it, more urgent this time. Then stepped toward the tent flap. Before she could step outside, the flap burst open. The tall warrior entered, 2 others flanking her. Their eyes swept over Ethan, then settled on the giantess. Words flew between them, fast, sharp, dangerous. Ethan didn't need to understand to know this was about him. The tall warrior pointed her spear directly at Ethan. The giantess stepped in front of him instantly. Her own spear coming up in a flash. The 2 women stood face to face, tension crackling. In the air, the other warriors gripped their weapons, ready to strike if given the signal. Ethan's heart pounded. He knew this could turn into a fight, and in a fight, he would be the weakest link. If the tall warrior won, his fate was sealed. The argument rose in volume until it was nearly a roar. Finally, the tall warrior jabbed the butt of her spear into the ground, speaking one last clipped sentence. Then she turned and walked out. The others following, the giantess stood still for a moment, her chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. Then she turned to Ethan. Her expression had changed. The softness was still there, but now it was layered with something else: determination. She knelt, bringing herself down to his level. She reached out and placed her palm against his chest, right over the pendant. Slowly, she spoke a sentence. He didn't know the words, but he understood them in his bones. You are mine, and I will protect you. She rose and motioned for him to follow her outside. The camp was gathered, a ring of giantesses standing in the glow of the fire pits. The tall warrior was there too, her spear planted firmly in the ground. She said something loud enough for all to hear. The others murmured in response. The giantess stepped forward, pulling Ethan gently into the circle. Her voice rang out, strong and unwavering. She spoke for a long time, gesturing to him, to the pendant, to the cloth with the faded image. Every word carried weight, even if Ethan couldn't understand it. When she finished, the camp was silent. Then, slowly, the murmurs began again, but softer now, less hostile. A few nodded. Some still frowned, but the circle began to break apart. The tension loosening. The tall warrior lingered, her gaze sharp, but she said nothing. She turned and left, disappearing into the shadows. The giantess turned to Ethan and lowered herself until their eyes met. For the first time since he had met her, she smiled, not a smirk, not a guarded expression, but a real smile. Ethan felt the weight of the moment. When he had first seen her in the wasteland, he had thought she was going to eat him alive, and she had just not in the way he feared. She had consumed his fear, replaced it with something dangerous in its own way. Trust. She reached out, lifting him effortlessly onto her shoulder. The campfires flickered around them as she carried him back toward her tent, her hand steady against his back, and in that moment, Ethan realized something he never thought he would. He wasn't her prisoner anymore. He was hers.